Under the cold shadow of the Pindus Mountains, when Thessaly's wind carried the scent of burned fields and wet stone, there stood an old monastery hidden among olive trees and wild lavender. Its white walls were cracked from years of war and weather, but every dawn its bells still rang, soft, slow, and stubborn. Inside, the sisters knelt in silence, praying not for victory but for mercy. They were called the Forgotten Sisters of Thessaly by the few villagers who still dared to whisper about them, for everyone knew that the Ottoman patrols had begun to move closer every day, and mercy was something no one expected anymore. It was the spring of 1822, or what passed for spring after years of blood and smoke. The Greek uprising had spread like wildfire, and the Ottoman Empire was striking back with a vengeance that turned rivers red. In the quiet corners of the province, stories drifted like ghosts. Some said an entire convent had vanished in one night. Others swore they'd seen Turkish soldiers dragging young women through the streets, their veils torn and their crosses thrown into the mud. But no one spoke too loudly, for walls had ears, and fear had learned to walk upright. The monastery's leader, an old nun whose eyes had seen too much, gathered the sisters in the candlelit hall that evening. She spoke with a calmness that did not match the shaking of her hands. "We will not run," she said. "We are his daughters. If they come, they will find us at prayer." Her words were brave, but her voice broke on the last syllable, and the youngest among them, barely 20, felt tears burn behind her eyelids. She wasn't sure if she prayed for courage or for a miracle. Outside, the night was restless. A storm rolled down from the mountains, carrying with it the echo of hooves and distant shouting. The Ottoman army had been seen in nearby villages, torching homes suspected of hiding rebels. The sisters could see the sky glow faintly orange on the horizon. Still, they kept their lamps low and sang hymns that trembled through the corridors like the hum of something fragile refusing to die. One of the villagers, an old shepherd, came knocking just before midnight. His cloak was wet from rain, his breath heavy with fear. "They're coming this way," he whispered, his eyes darting toward the road. 24 soldiers, maybe more. They burned Calidromo village, and now they're searching for your chapel. They think you're hiding a rebel priest." The sisters exchanged glances. They were hiding someone. In the underground crypt, a wounded Greek freedom fighter lay unconscious, his bandaged side still bleeding. He had stumbled into their courtyard 2 nights ago, clutching a broken rifle and a silver cross. The young nun had been the one to find him, and against every rule of their order she had begged the Mother Superior to let him stay. "He is one of ours," she'd whispered. "God would not forgive us if we turned him away." Now that choice was about to bring death to their doorstep. The Mother Superior dismissed the shepherd with a trembling blessing, then turned to her sisters. "If it is God's will that we suffer," she said softly, "we will do so with grace. But no one must speak of the man below. Do you hear me? No one." The youngest nodded, though her heart beat like a drum inside her chest. She had seen the soldier's face, pale and calm even in pain, and she couldn't bear the thought of what they might do to him if he were found. By dawn, the sound of boots on gravel echoed through the valley. The Ottoman riders came with banners wet from rain, their sabers catching the weak light of morning. The sisters watched from the narrow windows as the soldiers dismounted. A tall officer led them, his cloak black, his beard trimmed sharp, his eyes like cold water. He called out in Turkish, demanding the doors be opened. When no one answered, he signaled with his hand. The doors were forced open with rifle butts. They entered like a tide of steel and mud. Candles flickered out. The air filled with the heavy sound of boots, the clatter of weapons against the stone floor. The officer walked through the rows of wooden pews, glancing at the icons, the candles, the faces of the women who knelt before him. "We are searching for a Greek rebel," he said through a translator. "A man wounded carrying a rifle and a silver cross." No one moved. No one spoke. The old nun only bowed her head. The officer's eyes fell on the youngest sister, the one with trembling hands and wet lashes. He walked closer, his boots echoing in the hollow space. "You," he said quietly. "Do you know of him?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her throat was dry as dust. The officer studied her face, then turned toward the altar. His voice was calm, almost kind. "If you tell the truth, no harm will come to you." But everyone in that hall knew that wasn't true. They searched every room, overturned every bench, tore open every curtain. One of the soldiers found the entrance to the crypt, the old wooden trapdoor hidden behind the altar. The officer descended first, his lantern cutting through the dark. The nuns stood above, whispering prayers that broke mid-sentence. Moments passed. Then came the sound of shouting from below and the clanging of steel. When the officer returned, he carried the Greek's silver cross in his hand. His men followed, dragging the wounded soldier behind them, his face bloodied but his eyes still burning with defiance. "So," the officer said softly, looking at the Mother Superior, "you give sanctuary to our enemies." The old nun said nothing. She only crossed herself and whispered something that made one of the soldiers laugh. The officer raised his hand and struck her. The youngest screamed, rushing forward, but another soldier caught her by the arm. She fell to her knees, sobbing as the officer turned toward the rest. "You have chosen rebellion over peace," he said. "Then you will have neither." His words hung in the air like smoke, and for a long moment, there was only silence. The kind of silence that falls before something terrible happens. Outside, thunder rolled again, shaking the stones. The officer gave a final command in Turkish, and his men spread through the monastery, slamming doors and blocking the exits. The sisters huddled together, clutching their crosses, their rosaries shaking in their hands. The young nun's eyes met the wounded soldier's. He mouthed something, a single word, before they dragged him away. She would remember that word for the rest of her life, though she would never tell anyone what it was. The officer stepped outside, watching the rain fall over the courtyard. He seemed almost thoughtful, like a man who had seen too much of war and forgotten what mercy looked like. "No witnesses," he muttered. And with those words, the fate of the monastery was sealed. That night, villagers miles away saw a glow in the sky again, brighter than before, redder, fiercer. Some said they heard screams carried on the wind. Others swore they saw angels over the burning hill. When the fire died and the dawn came, the monastery was gone. Only blackened stones and melted bells remained. But the story didn't end there. Weeks later, a traveling priest found a small cross by the river, tangled in reeds. A cross shaped like the one the young sister used to wear. And nearby, faint footprints led into the forest, as though someone had walked barefoot through the ashes, carrying something heavy. Or someone. No one ever knew what truly happened to the forgotten sisters of Thessaly, but whispers said that one of them had survived. Some claimed she was seen years later in a distant village, teaching children by candlelight. Others said she took a vow of silence and never spoke again. What the Ottomans did that night was spoken of only in hushed tones, as if the land itself didn't want to remember. But the mountains did, and when the wind moves through Thessaly at dusk, some say it still carries the echo of that final prayer, trembling like a voice that refuses to die. When the smoke cleared over the monastery's ruins, the valley fell into a silence so heavy it almost felt like mourning. Days passed, then weeks, and the wind carried away the scent of burned wood and candle wax. But people still avoided the hill. Shepherds took longer routes, and children were warned not to go near the place where the sisters turned to ash. But some nights, villagers swore they saw a flicker of light among the blackened stones, as if a single candle still burned for the dead. A month later, an old farmer named Petros was walking through the riverbank, looking for driftwood. His dog began barking near a thicket, tail low, ears pressed back. When Petros pushed through the reeds, he froze. There, kneeling beside the water, was a woman. Her clothes were torn and her skin pale as winter milk, streaked with ash and dried blood. She didn't look at him when he called out, only kept staring into the water, her hand clutching a silver cross so tightly her knuckles were white. Petros took her to the village, where she spoke little and ate less. When they asked who she was, she only whispered, "A sister." That was all. The priest recognized the cross immediately. It belonged to one of the nuns from the monastery. The villagers crossed themselves, whispering that she was a ghost who had wandered out of the fire. But Petros said no. She was flesh and blood, breathing, though her eyes looked like they'd seen things no one should. They gave her shelter in a small stone cottage near the chapel. At night, she would wake screaming, her hands clutching at the sheets, whispering prayers no one understood. The priest tried to comfort her, asking gently about what happened that night. But every time he did, her face went white and her lips pressed shut. "Some things," she said once, "should not be spoken, Father. They burn the tongue." The villagers began to notice strange things. Sometimes at dusk, she would walk barefoot into the fields, leaving behind small trails of salt and candle wax. Other times, she would kneel by the chapel door, murmuring the same prayer over and over, not in Greek, but in Latin. The priest recognized some of the words. "Deliver us from evil." No one dared ask her what she prayed for. Over time, she began to help the village women, tending to the sick, washing wounds, blessing newborns. She had a calmness that unsettled people, a quiet strength, as if she had already died once and come back wiser. When she smiled, it was faint, like light slipping through clouds. Children followed her, calling her the silent sister. But peace, even that fragile kind, does not last long in places scarred by war. One morning, a group of horsemen arrived. Their uniforms were Ottoman, but their faces were tired and their voices rough with drink. They said they were looking for deserters, rebels who had fled north toward the hills. The priest came out to meet them, bowing his head respectfully, but the men didn't come for blessings. They wanted food, coin, and whatever shelter the villagers could offer. When they saw the silent sister, one of them laughed. "Another holy woman?" he said, his eyes tracing the cross at her neck. "You people breed martyrs faster than you breed goats." The priest stepped between them, trying to calm the situation, but the soldier shoved him aside. The sister didn't move. She stood still, her eyes steady on the man. Something in her calmness seemed to unnerve him. He muttered something under his breath and turned away. The soldiers stayed the night, drinking and shouting until the moon was high. But they left the next morning, though not before one of them disappeared. His body was found near the river the following day, face down in the reeds. The villagers said it was bandits, but some swore they saw the silent sister walking near the water that same night, her white dress glowing faintly in the dark. The priest called her to the chapel. "Tell me the truth," he said softly. "Did you see anything?" She looked at him for a long time, her eyes tired but sharp. "God sees everything," she answered. But men rarely listen. Word of the dead soldier spread quickly. Within a week, more Ottoman troops arrived, this time not drunk, not wandering, but organized. They searched every house, every barn, every field. The captain in charge was a man named Idris Bey, known for his cold discipline. He questioned the villagers one by one, until finally he came to the chapel where the sister sat praying. He asked her name, and she gave none. He asked where she was from, and she pointed toward the burned hill. Idris stared at her for a long time, then said, "There are no survivors from that place." She bowed her head. "Then I am not here," she whispered. That night Idris stayed in the village, and though he said little, his eyes followed her every move. When the priest asked if she feared him, she said quietly, "Fear belongs to the living." Later, when the rain began, she lit a candle in the chapel and knelt before the altar. Idris entered silently, watching her from the shadows. "You know what they say," he told her. "A soul that refuses to rest becomes a curse." She turned to face him. "A soul that refuses to forget," she said, "becomes a witness." He frowned, as if her words struck something buried inside him. "You saw what happened that night?" She nodded once. "Then tell me," he said. "Tell me what my men did." Her eyes lifted to his, steady as the flame before her. "You already know," she said. "But you will not carry it until you kneel." For a moment, Idris stood motionless. Then he turned and left, the door slamming behind him. From that night on, strange things began to happen again. The soldiers grew restless. Horses refused to approach the monastery ruins. Fires would not stay lit near the hill. One morning, a patrol returned with only half its men. The rest vanished in the mist. Idris Bey began to look more like a man haunted than in command. The silent sister spent her nights by the chapel window, watching the horizon. She no longer prayed for mercy. She prayed for memory, that the world would not forget what was done to her sisters. Sometimes she spoke their names softly, one after another, as if calling them back from the smoke. The villagers started leaving small offerings at her door: bread, olive oil, wildflowers, not as gifts, but as tokens of fear and respect. They didn't know what she was anymore. Holy woman or curse, she carried something that frightened even the soldiers. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Idris returned to the chapel. His face was pale, his eyes red from sleepless nights. He said he'd dreamed of the monastery, of women standing in fire, their voices rising like a choir. "They said my name," he muttered, his hands shaking. "They said I must atone." The sister watched him silently. "And will you?" she asked. He didn't answer. He just fell to his knees, trembling, whispering prayers that no one had taught him. That same night, the villagers woke to the sound of thunder again, but the sky was clear. The air smelled of rain and smoke. When they looked toward the burned monastery hill, they saw something moving among the ruins. Some said it was a figure in white. Others said it was many, shapes walking through the ashes carrying candles that never went out. At dawn, Idris Bey was gone. His horse was found near the river, reins hanging loose, saddle empty. The soldiers searched for him for days but found nothing except his cloak, caught on a thorn bush near the ruins. The silent sister never spoke of it. She tended to the sick that morning as if nothing had happened, though her hands trembled when she touched the holy water. The priest noticed and asked, "Did you see him?" She looked away. Some men must lose themselves before they can be found. That was the last thing she ever said about the officer. As summer came, the war moved north, and the village began to rebuild its quiet life. But sometimes when the wind blew from the mountains, the bell of the burned monastery could still be heard, faint, almost like a memory, and at night the sister still walked to the river, kneeling where Petros had once found her. She would light a small candle and let it float downstream, watching it drift until it disappeared into the dark. The villagers didn't follow her anymore. They understood in their own way that some griefs don't end, they just find new prayers. And deep beneath that river, under layers of silt and time, something waited, something that still carried the silver cross of Thessaly's forgotten sisters, and a story the world wasn't yet ready to hear. Autumn came to Thessaly like a slow sigh. The air grew colder, the olive trees dropped their leaves, and the river shrank into a quiet trickle through the reeds. The war had moved further north, yet the scars it left behind still bled in silence. The village that once bustled with chatter now spoke in whispers. People worked in fields but looked often toward the hill where the monastery had burned, as though afraid it might wake again. The silent sister rarely left her small stone cottage now. The villagers still brought her food and candles, but she spent most of her days inside, her hands tracing the worn wooden cross she always carried. Sometimes the priest saw her through the chapel window, kneeling for hours, eyes closed, lips moving faintly. He never disturbed her. He had begun to believe she prayed not to God, but to those she lost. But one evening, when the sun had fallen and the shadows of the mountains stretched long and cold, a new stranger rode into the village. He was no soldier. His coat was dusty, his beard untrimmed, his horse thin from travel. He introduced himself simply as a historian, a man sent from the southern provinces to gather records of the war and the burned monasteries. His voice was calm, polite, but his eyes held the tired sharpness of a man who had seen too much. He came to the priest first, asking about the ruins. The priest hesitated. Outsiders were rare now, and even rarer were those who asked about the sisters. Still, he offered what little he knew, that only one had survived, and that she lived quietly among them. The historian's brow furrowed. "One survivor," he murmured. "I was told they all perished." That night he asked to meet her. When he knocked on her door, she opened it without surprise, as though she had known he was coming. The candlelight flickered against her pale face, and the man bowed slightly. "Sister," he said, "I came seeking truth. They say your monastery held something sacred, a relic the Ottomans wanted, a cross of gold said to have belonged to St. Demetrius." Her expression didn't change, but her voice was soft when she spoke. "There are things more sacred than gold," she said, "and some things more cursed." The man smiled faintly. "Then perhaps you can help me separate one from the other." She didn't invite him in, but she didn't turn him away either. "Whatever you seek," she said, "you'll find only ashes." Then she closed the door gently, leaving him standing in the cold. The next morning, the historian went to the ruins. He walked among the blackened stones, brushing away ash with his gloves, sketching the cracked bell tower and what remained of the chapel. Beneath the old altar he found something odd, a faint carving, almost erased by fire. It wasn't Greek, it looked older, a circle with 4 lines running through it, and the faint shape of wings. That night, he returned to the village and told the priest what he'd found. The priest paled at the description. "That mark," he said, "was forbidden centuries ago. It belonged to the order before Rome took control. They called it the Seal of Light and Fire. Some said it guarded relics too holy to be seen." The historian leaned closer. "Then what were the sisters guarding?" The priest hesitated, glancing toward the sisters' cottage through the window. "Maybe not guarding," he said quietly. "Maybe burying." From that night, unease crept back into the village. The historian's questions stirred old fears, and the sister's silence began to trouble people again. The children who used to bring her flowers stopped going near her home. Dogs barked at her door at dusk and whimpered away. It was as if something had shifted in the air, a heaviness no one could name. The priest noticed it too. When he spoke to her one evening, her eyes looked distant, unfocused, as though she were listening to something far away. "They will come again," she said quietly. "Men who carry torches and say they serve God, but their hearts burn for power. They always come." He asked who she meant, but she only shook her head. Days later, the historian returned to the ruins, this time with 2 local men. They began digging near the old crypt, following the faint carvings etched into the stone. Beneath the rubble, they uncovered a sealed door, small, iron-bound, and marked with the same strange symbol. It took all 3 of them to pry it open. Inside was nothing at first but the stale scent of smoke and dust. Then they found it, a small wooden chest, charred but intact. The historian opened it carefully, expecting bones or relics, but instead found pages. Dozens of them, blackened at the edges but still legible. The writing was in Latin and Greek, mixed with symbols he didn't recognize. He brought the chest to the chapel, laying it on the altar. The priest stared at it with unease. "You should not have disturbed this," he murmured. The sister entered then, as if drawn by something unseen. When she saw the chest, her breath caught. She reached out, but stopped just short of touching it. "You shouldn't have opened that," she whispered. The historian frowned. "You know what it is, don't you?" Her eyes filled with something between sorrow and fear. "It's the reason they came." He leaned closer. "The Ottomans?" "No," she said softly. "Not just them. Every empire that touches Thessaly eventually looks for it. They called it the Testament of Fire. It held prayers that could bless or destroy depending on whose tongue spoke them." The priest crossed himself. "That's superstition." She turned to him, her face pale in the candlelight. "You saw what became of those who mocked the sacred." Before anyone could speak, a crash echoed outside. Horses, shouting, boots. The villagers ran through the square, warning that soldiers were coming again. Not Ottomans this time, but a new patrol from the northern front. The war had shifted, and with it came men hungry for treasure, not faith. The sister blew out the candle. "Hide it," she whispered. "They must never know it survived." The historian looked torn. "If this text is what you say it belongs to history, it belongs to silence," she said. "You'll understand when you read it, if you can bear the weight." The soldiers arrived before dawn. Their captain was young, almost boyish, but his eyes carried the same weariness Idris once had. They searched for rebels, they said, but their gaze lingered too long on the chapel. When they saw the historian's horse outside, they grew suspicious. The captain demanded to see what was being hidden. The priest tried to speak calmly, explaining that they were only preserving church relics, but one of the soldiers shoved him aside. They searched the chapel, overturning benches, ripping open the altar cloth. The sister stood motionless through it all, her hands clasped tightly around the wooden cross. When the captain found the chest, he lifted it with a grin. "You Greeks hide gold in your prayers," he said mockingly. The historian tried to intervene, but the sister stepped forward. "That is not yours," she said firmly. The captain laughed. "It is now." He ordered his men to take it to the camp by the river. The sister didn't move, didn't shout. She simply watched him, and for a moment, something in her gaze made the young officer hesitate. He turned away quickly, as though afraid to meet her eyes again. That night, rain poured hard over the valley. The river swelled and churned, and thunder rolled over the mountains. The soldiers kept to their tents, guarding the chest. The sister knelt in her cottage, whispering the same prayer again and again until her lips bled. The priest stayed awake too, unable to shake the feeling that something was about to break loose. By morning, the camp by the river was gone. The rain had stopped, but the ground was torn, the tents shredded. The chest lay open near the water's edge, empty. No bodies were found, no horses, no weapons. Only the faint smell of smoke and the echo of something that sounded almost like singing, far off in the mist. The villagers gathered at the riverbank, murmuring in fear. The sister stood apart, her eyes on the horizon. The historian approached her, his voice trembling. "What happened to them?" She didn't look at him. "They read what wasn't meant to be spoken," she said softly. "And the mountain took its due," he swallowed hard. "Then it's true." Her gaze drifted toward the hills, where faint figures seemed to move between the trees. Or maybe it was only the fog. "Truth and curse are not so different," she murmured. The wind rose then, carrying the faint chime of metal, like the echo of a bell buried deep beneath the earth. The villagers turned away, but the historian kept staring at the empty chest, his heart pounding. That night, he packed his things to leave, But before dawn, he stopped at the sister's door one last time. "If I write what happened here," he said, "will anyone believe it?" She looked at him with tired eyes. "Write it anyway," she said. "The world forgets too easily, and forgetting is how evil begins again." He nodded slowly, though his hands shook as he mounted his horse. When he rode away, he glanced back only once. She was still standing there in the mist, holding the silver cross, her figure pale against the darkening hills, like a ghost watching over a land that refused to heal. And somewhere beneath the monastery ruins, deep in the stones blackened by fire, something stirred again, as if waiting for another dawn, another trespass, another voice foolish enough to awaken the testament of fire. The first frost came early that year, painting the fields in white before the harvest was done. The villagers of Thessaly worked faster, wrapping their arms in rags, glancing often toward the river where the soldiers had vanished. The silence there was heavier than before, and no one dared fish or fetch water near that bend. Even the birds avoided it. The priest said prayers every morning for the lost souls, though he wasn't sure if they were dead or taken by something older than death. The silent sister seemed weaker with each passing day. Her face grew pale, her hands trembled when she tried to light candles, and her eyes, once calm and distant, now carried something haunted. The priest visited her often, but she spoke little. "It's not over," she whispered once. When they read it, they didn't free the curse. They fed it. He didn't ask what she meant. He had learned that some truths were better left half-hidden, like bones beneath a church floor. But the historian hadn't left. Though he had packed his horse and sworn to go, something pulled him back. He stayed in the village inn, filling pages with notes by lamplight, studying the markings he had copied from the burned crypt. He told himself it was for history, for knowledge. But every night he dreamed of the river, of the voices in the mist, of faces flickering in the water like broken reflections. He'd wake drenched in sweat, the sound of distant bells ringing in his ears. Then one morning, a group of men arrived from the coast. They were not soldiers. They wore fine coats and carried surveying tools and maps. The villagers whispered that they were scholars or treasure seekers. The leader introduced himself as Dr. Melas, from Athens, claiming he had heard rumors of an ancient manuscript connected to early Christian mysticism, something buried in the mountains of Thessaly. The historian recognized one of the names he mentioned, the Testament of Fire. He felt his blood run cold. That night, he went to the sister. "They're here for it," he said. "You must tell me where it is before they find it." She looked at him with tired eyes. "Would you destroy it if you could?" He hesitated. "If it saves lives, yes." Her voice was low but steady. "It doesn't want to be destroyed. It wants to be believed." The men from Athens set up camp near the ruins, bringing lanterns, spades, and strange instruments. They treated the burned hill like a riddle waiting to be solved. The villagers avoided them. The sister watched from her window as they climbed the blackened stones, marking the ground with chalk, measuring the air as if holiness could be trapped with numbers. By the third night, something changed. The wind grew restless. Dogs barked all night, and the bells of the chapel began to tremble without being touched. The priest thought it was the storm, but the next morning, the youngest of the scholars was gone. They found his boots near the crypt and his lantern, still burning, though the wick had long since burned out. The leader insisted it was an accident, that the man had wandered off and fallen into the river. But the villagers knew better. They'd seen the same look in the sky before, the same dark swirl of clouds that hung over the monastery the night it burned. The historian begged them to leave. "You don't understand what you're waking," he told Melas, but Melas only laughed. "My friend," he said, "superstition is a luxury for the poor. Knowledge is power." That night, the sister came to the chapel for the first time in weeks. The priest found her kneeling before the altar, clutching her cross so tightly that blood ran down her fingers. "They're close," she said. "They've opened the lower chamber." He tried to calm her, but she shook her head. It wasn't meant to be found. The words in those pages, they weren't written for men to read aloud. The storm broke before midnight. Wind tore through the valley, ripping branches and slamming shutters. The men's tents were scattered across the ruins, their torches flickering wildly. Lightning cracked across the sky, and for a heartbeat, the entire monastery hill glowed white. The historian saw them through the rain, figures moving where no man should be, shapes made of light and ash walking through the smoke, the same faces he had seen in his dreams. He ran toward the ruins, shouting for them to stop, but his voice was lost in the wind. He found Melas standing before the opened crypt, a lantern in one hand and the blackened pages in the other. His eyes were wild with awe. "It's true," he shouted. "It's all true. Look at this, look." The sister appeared behind him, her white dress soaked, her hair whipping in the wind. "Put it down," she cried. "You don't know what you're saying." Melas turned to her, his face lit by the lightning. "These are prayers," he said. "They speak of fire that cleanses the world, of light that reveals the divine. Don't you see? It's not a curse, it's a key." The sister's voice broke. "It's both." Then the air split with a sound that wasn't thunder. A deep resonant hum rose from the ground, shaking the stones. The lanterns burst one by one. The wind stopped all at once, leaving only the echo of chanting, voices overlapping, whispering in tongues neither Greek nor Latin. Melas dropped the pages, his eyes wide. The historian grabbed the sister's arm, pulling her back. "What's happening?" he shouted. Her face was pale as ash. "They've opened it." The testament was never a book. It was a binding, a seal. The ruins began to glow faintly, red and gold beneath the rain. The symbol carved into the stones burned like iron in a forge. The men who had been digging fell to their knees, clutching their heads. One screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the wind that suddenly returned, howling through the valley like something alive. The priest stumbled up the hill, clutching his cross. "Stop this madness," he cried, though his voice was barely a whisper against the roar. He reached for the sister, but the force of the storm threw him back. The historian helped him up, both of them staring in disbelief as the earth cracked near the altar. From within the fissure came light, not the warm kind, but cold and sharp, flickering like fire under ice. The sister's voice trembled. "They've broken the covenant." Then the bells began to ring, all of them. The chapel bell, the ruined monastery bell, and the faint distant one from across the valley, all tolling together in uneven rhythm. The villagers fell to their knees, praying through tears. Down by the river, the water began to rise again, churning though there had been no rain. The priest's candle blew out. The sister stepped forward, her cross glowing faintly now, her eyes locked on the burning ruins. "It's calling for balance," she said. "Something must be taken for what was released." The historian caught her arm. "What do you mean?" She looked at him then, and in her eyes he saw everything. The night of fire, the screams, the vow she had made in the ashes. Someone must finish what they started. Someone must close it again. He shook his head. "How?" But before she could answer, Melas stumbled toward them, clutching one of the pages. His voice was hoarse, frantic. "I can fix it. I can rewrite it," he shouted. "It's just words." The sister reached out to stop him, but he tore free and began to recite the words aloud, his voice breaking over each phrase. The sound cut through the storm like a blade, and then the earth gave way beneath him. The historian lunged forward, but the sister pulled him back. "It's too late," she cried. The ground swallowed the man whole, the pages scattering into the air like burned leaves. For a moment everything went silent again. The wind stopped, the river stilled. Even the bells faded. The only sound left was the faint crackling of the ruins, glowing red beneath the rain. The sister sank to her knees, trembling. "It's not sealed," she whispered. "It's only waiting." The historian looked down at the river valley where mist began to rise again, slow, swirling, carrying faint shapes within it. The villagers had begun to flee, clutching children and crosses, shouting prayers that vanished into the fog. The priest called out for them to stay together, but his voice was lost. The sister rose slowly, her hands steady now. "This valley was built on a prayer," she said softly. "Now it will decide who still deserves to be heard." The historian stared at her. "You can't mean—" "I was spared once," she said. "Perhaps only to bear witness." And as the storm began again, louder, crueler, tearing through trees and stone, the sister walked toward the burning ruins, her white dress glowing faintly against the darkness, the silver cross blazing in her hands. The historian tried to follow, but the wind forced him back, pushing him to the ground. The last thing he saw through the blinding light was her silhouette standing at the edge of the fissure, her arms raised, the flames wrapping around her like a crown. Then came the sound of shattering stone, the roar of water breaking free, and a light that consumed everything around it, bright enough to erase the night itself. When it faded, the hill was silent again. But beneath that silence, deep in the earth, something still breathed. Morning came quietly over Thessaly, the kind of morning that felt like the world was holding its breath. The storm was gone, leaving behind a valley washed clean and pale under the soft gold of dawn. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke. Birds perched silently on the blackened olive trees, as if unsure whether to sing. Where the monastery once stood, the ground was split open in deep scars, steaming faintly as if the fire beneath still lingered. The historian woke among the ruins, half buried in ash. His clothes were torn, his hands scraped raw, but he was alive. Around him, the world looked hollowed out. Broken stones, twisted iron, the faint hum of wind through the cracks. He pushed himself upright, coughing, calling out for anyone who might still be there. But the only reply was the distant echo of his own voice. He found the priest lying near the chapel steps, still clutching his wooden cross. The old man was breathing weakly, his lips moving in prayer. When he saw the historian kneel beside him, his eyes flickered open. "Is it over?" he whispered. The historian didn't know how to answer. He looked toward the burned hill where the fissure had been. The glow was gone now, but the stones still trembled faintly under his feet. "I think," he said softly, "she ended it." The priest's eyes filled with tears. "God have mercy," he murmured. She always carried more faith than fear. They buried the sister by the river that evening. The villagers who had fled returned slowly through the day, drawn by the silence that followed the storm. No one spoke when they saw the cross the historian carved for her grave, set into the wet earth beside the water. The river moved calmly again, its surface smooth and still as though it had forgotten what it swallowed. The priest said a quiet prayer over her resting place. "May her soul find peace," he said, "and may her sacrifice keep this valley safe." The historian stayed long after the others left. He sat by the grave until nightfall, listening to the river and the wind in the trees. His notebook, the one filled with sketches and notes about relics and ruins, lay open on his lap. But the pages felt heavy now, meaningless. He had come searching for history and found something older than history itself. Faith, guilt, and the price of knowledge. When he finally rose, he saw something strange across the water. A small, steady light glowed among the reeds, a candle flame drifting with the current. It flickered but never went out, even as the wind picked up. He watched it until it disappeared around the bend, a silent farewell to the woman who had kept the valley's secret. Over the next weeks, the villagers began rebuilding. They repaired the chapel roof, tilled the blackened fields, and replanted olives where the monastery once stood. The priest grew frail but smiled more often, telling the children stories of the sister who prayed fire back into the ground. Some said she was a saint, others whispered she had been something else entirely. But everyone agreed that since that night, the valley had been quieter, almost too quiet, as if it were still listening for her voice. The historian wrote everything down, though not for the world. His journals filled with the story of the sisters of Thessaly, the testament of fire, and the night the sky itself seemed to burn. He described it not as myth but as memory. When he tried to publish it, though, the scholars in Athens laughed him off. A fable, they said. A villager's tale wrapped in superstition. So he kept the papers for himself, hidden in a wooden chest, far from curious hands. But the nightmares didn't stop. Some nights he dreamed of her standing on the hill again, her dress white, her eyes calm. Other nights he saw the fissure reopening, voices whispering from the dark below. He'd wake with the sound of bells in his ears and the taste of ash on his tongue. Once he even returned to Thessaly, hoping to find peace by her grave. The village had changed. A new chapel stood by the river, built from the same black stones that once belonged to the monastery. The priest had passed on, and a younger man now led the prayers. The historian asked if anyone still remembered the silent sister. The young priest nodded slowly. "My grandmother spoke of her," he said. Said she carried light in her hands. Some claim to see her walking near the river on stormy nights, but I've never seen her myself. That evening, the historian stood by the riverbank again. The air was cool, and the water shimmered with the reflection of the moon. He laid a small candle by her grave and whispered a prayer he didn't fully understand. "If you can hear me," he said, "I kept my promise. I never let them find it." For a long while, nothing stirred. Then a soft breeze moved through the trees, carrying the faint scent of lavender. The candle flame bent but didn't go out. He smiled faintly, a quiet peace settling in his chest. Years passed, and the valley healed. The olive trees grew tall again, and travelers no longer spoke of the curse of Thessaly. The monastery's ruins faded into legend, a story mothers told to warn their children about pride and forbidden knowledge. Yet sometimes, when storms rolled down from the mountains, the wind still carried a strange echo. A low, solemn hum, like distant chanting. The villagers said it was just the air moving through the stones, but old Petros, who had lived long enough to remember the first fire, would shake his head and say, "No, that's them." The sister still keeping watch. In time, the historian grew old and gray. He lived quietly near the coast, his hands too weak to write, but his mind still clear. One night, as the tide rose high and the sea howled against the cliffs, he dreamed of Thessaly again. He saw the sister walking through the monastery garden, alive and unburned, her veil clean and white. She turned to him and said, "The burden is lighter now." When he woke, the storm had passed, and the first light of dawn shone through his window. His journal lay open on the table, though he hadn't touched it in years. On the blank page, written in his old handwriting, were 6 words: "Faith survives where fire once burned." He died that morning peacefully, with a faint smile on his face. When the villagers from Thessaly came years later to collect his belongings, they found the journal sealed and untouched. They took it home and placed it in the chapel, beside the cross that marked the silent sister's grave. Generations later, children still came to see that grave by the river. They'd lay flowers or candles and listen to the stories of the woman who had saved the valley from itself. Some said her spirit walked the hills when the bells rang after midnight. Others claimed she visited the sick in dreams. Whether she was a saint, a martyr, or something between the two, no one knew for sure. But everyone in Thessaly believed that their peace, the gentle seasons, the quiet harvest, the calm river, was the echo of her prayer. As for the testament of fire, it was never found again. The fissure sealed itself over the years, hidden by moss and stone. Scholars who came later called it folklore, yet none could explain why compasses failed near the old monastery site, or why candles burned with a strange blue flame during storms. Some truths, it seemed, had simply become part of the land. And when the wind rose through Thessaly's valleys, brushing through the olive groves and whispering across the water, it carried with it the faintest sound of a bell, not loud, not mournful, just a soft, steady tone like a heart that refused to stop beating. The valley remembered. And somewhere beyond the reach of time and war, the silent sister finally rested. Not in shadow, not in fire, but in the quiet grace of the faith she had never abandoned.